Here in Chapter 14, we're going to take a look at the way that language, writing, and critical thinking all overlap. It's quite a skill to be able to convey thoughts and ideas into writing, and it's an important one because that's the main way that in academia we communicate information. So if we're going to talk about critical thinking and psychology, then we need to be talking about the way that we convey our ideas. And even though this is chapter 14 in the text, I like to talk about it first because it also coincides with some of the finer points of APA writing, more about the philosophy and the theory behind what you write than more about how you write it. So we are going to dive into this and cover a few learning objectives. First, we're going to explain the relationship between language and thinking. And for some people, there is not much of a relationship between language and thinking, but we're going to make an attempt to bridge those gaps as we talk about them. We're going to identify propaganda and various abuses and misuses of language and related thinking errors. What's kind of funny about language and writing is that people sometimes will define style, which is kind of the way that we write in different disciplines, as clever ways to get around the rules. And propaganda, for example, intentionally violates the rules of language and the rules of communicating information for the sole purpose of usually deceiving people or getting people to think a certain way. Really, it's an oversight of critical thinking. All right, we're also going to talk about the use of language as argumentation, so that we can do it appropriately, so that we can make arguments that are well founded in psychology. And when we talk about the word argue, we don't just mean to go back and forth for the sake of being confrontational. That's not what an argument is. An argument is a well-reasoned thing. We'll get into that later. And then last, how to construct a good extended argument in a critical thinking essay. So there'll be some times where you're going to be asked to explain something or to evaluate something or to describe something. And sometimes we just kind of like have this kind of like thought diarrhea where we just kind of put all of our thoughts out there and we see what it looks like on the paper. We might make some revisions, but we just call it good. But there's a much more methodical way to do that, and we will take a look at how to do that. So let's start with a quick what do you think? So do you think in words? Okay, that's a question. Do you think in words? Okay. How often, when you have written about an idea, did it help you more clearly think about that idea? Okay. So when we think about the writing process, does it help you to refine what you think? There's kind of this cliche that we know what we think when we speak, meaning that when we talk about something, we kind of have this feedback loop in our brains where we start to learn what we know. Does that happen with writing too? And if it does, ought we be writing so that we can better know what we know? All right. So when you look at this scale, do you never think that you think more clearly based on your writing? Or do you always, or sometimes? Most people will probably think sometimes. And people will hopefully think that they always think better when they write. But some people think, well, writing doesn't really help me. Probably because the writing is not intentional. So we'll take a look at some situations where writing is very important to the process of thinking. And it can engage our thinking, and it can extend our thinking beyond just the thoughts that we have, and to take those thoughts and make them more critical. So in other words, according to the text, most people report that they think in words at least some of the time, as when they talk to themselves. So we call that subvocalization, that voice that you have when you're reading a book and you hear the words aloud. Okay, those are the words that we tend to hear ourselves. But we also might think about things in words when we're working on something, or we're being critical of our own work or something. We're think, oh man, why'd you do that for? And there's this thought inside of your head. Sometimes it's not your own voice, by the way. It could be some other voice, but typically we'll have a voice in our heads. Okay? And many people, based on data, think that writing helps them think more clearly about an idea, which is exactly why we want to be writing and processing language in terms of the words that we can articulate to other people, so that we can start to learn what we know. Okay, So these are just some kind of rhetorical questions, some what do you think type questions, just to kind of ponder, not really have an answer necessarily, but just some things for you to think of. So what is the relationship between language and thinking? How specifically do advertisers, politicians, and others use language to persuade you? And they do. How might language be misused to produce thinking errors and impede clear thinking? And then how might improving your critical thinking improve your writing and vice versa? These are all kind of rhetorical for now. We'll get into them as we go through this lecture. So let's get into language in thinking. So what is language? Sometimes we take it for granted that we know what language is. And you have to know that language is a lot more complex than just what we say. And when we think about the complexities of it, we can easily start to think about how important it is to have clear language and a way for us to communicate information using language. And that's spoken and written language, by the way. Okay. So language is a system of communication that uses symbols such as words and a set of rules called grammar to make meaningful statements. Okay, so words are symbols. They mean something. We have grammar that puts these words in a certain order that changes the way that they mean. If we say a sentence and the words are out of order, it can change the meaning of the sentence. It can make it incoherent. So words are important, and so are the order that they occur in. Okay. When we have these words, we can combine them in theoretically an infinite amount of ways. And some ways are better than others at communicating information, which is an important thing for us to know. That's where we get the word clarity from when we talk about writing. So organizing our thoughts and our words and conveying our ideas through our words becomes very important, because not only does it make it clear, it can also change the meaning. Okay. So when we think about language and argumentation, again, argumentation is not meant to be like this confrontational thing where you're just arguing with me. An argument is a good thing. It's where two people have different claims and they come together with those claims and talk about them and decide on what might be the more appropriate conclusion to the argument. That's a fine thing to have. Most people think of, again, arguments as these these contests, these things that we can try to win. Okay. So which terms from the language of argumentation in the appendix could you use to provide the appropriate signal? Okay. So this is an appendix in your book, by the way. So you can refer to that if you want to pause this and do that. That's fine. Okay. So which terms could you use to signal that evidence is provided? So if you've found some evidence and you want to convey it, what might you say to somebody that would signal to them that, hey, I'm talking about evidence that I provided? And then the second one, which terms could you use to signal that you are making a distinction? So if you're trying to distinguish between two types of evidence, what words might you use to do that? So if you want to pause and think about it for a minute, you can do that. But here comes the answer to that. And by the way, there are more phrases than these, but we can use things that talk about the evidence that's provided is something like on account of or because. Demonstrates the fact that. Okay, so that suggests that there is evidence that's being provided that is contributing to the argument. Okay. If you're trying to make a distinguishing remark between two ideas, you can say, well, this distinguishes between A and B. A is different from B. In contrast to B, comma, A does this. Or unlike A, B says this. Right, so we can use these terms. And I think at the collegiate level, we kind of know these and we use them kind of natively. But sometimes using sometimes using words natively doesn't really give us the intentionality about our writing. It just kind of comes out. And sometimes we can get caught using words because we've always used them that way, almost as a tradition. So we need to be more intentional about that, which is why we tend to have things like a short appendix of words that distinguish between different types of information you're trying to convey. So do rely on those, because sometimes we misuse things just out of habit, and we need to be able to break those habits. So language has a way to improve or support thinking by externalizing what we're thinking and to make it observable to others. The thing about it is that most people are external processors anyways. If they're trying to work through something, they might talk about it. And they don't realize that talking about it helps them work through it. They can hear how they sound. They can hear tone and inflection. They might understand that there is a difference between what they're thinking about and what they're saying in terms of what it sounds like. So maybe you've said something where, oh, geez, I didn't realize it sounded like that until I said it. Maybe it did come across the wrong way. So we use this externalizing process not only to work through something, but also to kind of create this feedback loop that says, oh, I'm hearing myself now. Now I recognize what I sound like, and I need to be maybe using a different tone or different words or whatever it is. One of the things that makes people feel really weird is to record themselves and listen back to it, much like I'm doing now. And when you go back and listen to things, you're like, wow, I really sounded weird then, or I didn't realize that I misspoke there. And maybe you have to go back and edit something or make a note that you misspoke or something like that. So having this external process is really helpful, especially for writing. I remember writing my dissertation, and I would be writing. You're writing, a dozen pages a night or something like that. Then you go back and review it, and you're like, who wrote this? This is complete nonsense. You have to go back and revise all these things. So not only does getting your words out there external to your mind, is that helpful for just kind of like telling people what you think, it's also good for going back and revising and editing. And then, you have something like a large dissertation or a research paper, and it's done, it gets approved, then you go back and look at it, and you're like, wow, there's lots of errors in here, just because you don't always go back and consciously look at the things that you're doing, or consciously process the words that you're saying. So when we go and we produce language, whether it's written or verbal, we have to be thinking about it. We have to be hearing ourselves, because that supports the way that we think. All right, let's move on to propaganda, persuasion, and motivated thinking. And these can all be very helpful things to know, but they can also be very dangerous, especially motivated thinking. But we'll start right at the top with persuasion. Okay, so persuasion is trying to convince somebody of something. Okay, and lots of times persuasion is motivated, meaning that we want to persuade somebody to do something because it benefits us somehow. So kind of at the worst, persuasion is when we try to convince somebody of something and it isn't always truthful, or it doesn't really have concern for the absolute truth of the matter. We might hide some facts about something. We might undersell something. So think of like a salesman who's trying to sell you a car, and they tell you all the wonderful features about the car, but they don't tell you about the fact that maybe it was in a flood, right? Or that it has a new transmission because the old transmission got shot or something like that. Whatever it is, there's not a lot of concern for the truth. Now, you can persuade somebody and be truthful. That is possible. But when we talk about in critical thinking, watching out for persuasion, we have to watch out for kind of this negative form of it where people are trying to get over on you. But we also know that there are persuasive essays, where you're asked to write a persuasive essay for, why you want to come to Olivet College. And when you think about that, you automatically think, well, you don't want to say anything bad about it. No, that you don't really want to highlight the bad things, but you still need to talk about, Olivet College is a small school, kind of a rural community, but what that does is it contributes to the tight-knit nature of the student body. Okay, so you can talk about something that's persuasive, that you want to come here because it's a tight-knit student body. At the same time, you're talking about what some people might consider a negative feature of Olivet College, is that we are in a rural setting. So you can kind of use persuasion to address the negatives, but almost as a way to highlight the positive. So again, you're kind of bending the truth of it. You're kind of glossing over something that you otherwise would have to defend in a different way. Okay? So you can use persuasion through pictures, which are interesting because we always say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Okay, yeah, that's fine. But when you use a persuasive picture, usually it's something, well, let's think of like a political cartoon, where you have something where somebody's trying to persuade you of something, and they have this political cartoon, and it's funny, it's clever, it's witty, and it can persuade you to think a certain way about something. So you can use pictures in that way. But advertisers also use persuasion when they are using things like billboards or coming up with ads or something like that. So you can have nonverbal messages, or persuasions as well. Okay. Now, propaganda is a little bit more insidious than persuasion. So if persuasion is trying to convince somebody of something, propaganda is trying to tell people how to think and what to think, right? So when we think of propaganda, I think one of the most common ways that propaganda was used in the last 100 years or so was probably the Nazi propaganda during World War II, but also probably the Soviets used propaganda for socialism and communism during the Cold War up through the 90s. And there's still propaganda now, right? There's always somebody who has some kind of political agenda that they want to perpetuate, but it's based on the communicating ideas that tell people how and what to think. And it's pretty insidious, and we'll get into this throughout the class as we look at ways to avoid propaganda. Okay. So propaganda can use inflammatory language. I love it, to whip up hatred of an enemy. It's an interesting choice of words, I think. But you can get people to think a certain way by using pictures. You can have signs, whatever it is. We've seen all these, especially I think maybe during the last 2 or 3 elections when we had some social issues that were on the table. So we had Barack Obama was the first black president to be elected, so there were social issues there. There were pockets of people that were very upset about that, and then we have the election with Donald Trump, where there were other sets of issues that were going on that people had, and there was propaganda. There were people that were trying to polarize the country based on their political ideology, and they used the propaganda. Okay, the thing is that propaganda is only propaganda to the people who don't like it, right? So if I'm trying to convey an idea or a way of thinking, I think it's educational. But if somebody disagrees with it, they think it's propaganda. They're trying to push a narrative. I think propaganda and narrative becomes synonymous because we talk about different narratives that are being perpetuated now. I think narrative is the current form of the word propaganda. You'd be very surprised at how many people are talking about, the liberals are all trying to brainwash college students. It's like, well, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but then again, that's the nature of what propaganda looks like. I think I'm educating somebody from the outside who doesn't like the idea of higher education would say that there's propaganda or that there's brainwashing or whatever it is. There are lots of synonyms for it. But when we have a class like critical thinking and psychology, we're trying to teach people how to recognize different types of information as it's conveyed. And sometimes you might even hear something from a professor or something that you disagree with. And you're like, wow, that's really not something that I agree with. But then you have to evaluate it. Is this meant to be like this insidious propaganda, or is it meant to be something that's information that's available for somebody to consume, but not necessarily to do it freely without looking at it? Again, that's another thing that we're going to take a look at throughout this course, is how we consume information. Here's an example of Nazi propaganda, and this is clearly an anti-Semitic image. This is it's called The Eternal Jew, the movie that this was based on. But this was meant to demonize Jewish people, right? So there's a caricature of a Jewish person made to look very unappealing, very angry type person. Maybe they're going to swindle you out of something, and very clearly marked with the sign of, or the Star of David on their forehead, right? So this was designed to get people who were anti-Semitic, the Nazis, to kind of rally around this negativity that they were all engaging in. And so to them it was, this is an awful person, we don't like this person, so we're going to make them look awful. And then the Jewish people clearly did not like this because it puts them in this kind of light and it dehumanizes them, which was one of the big issues during the Nazi regime in World War II. And they didn't like it, so to them it was propaganda. Okay. So it's a very clear example of how propaganda was used to vilify an entire people. Now, we also use emotive language, right? So emotive language is designed to convey some kind of information about something in a way that uses emotion to trigger somebody into feeling a certain way. Okay, so we have this negative association. Emotive language is almost never talked about in a positive light. Like, I use emotive language to make somebody feel good. No, not really. It's usually I use emotive language in order to make somebody not like somebody and to feel the same way about them that I do. Okay. One of the ways that you can do that is by referring to Native Americans as savages, right? Which is how they justify their mistreatment of the American Indians or the Native Americans, First Nations people. That's another term that's gone through a lot of iterations of correctness. So there are different ways to say that are varyingly correct. I think First Nations is pretty standard now. Native Americans has been used, and American Indians has also been used to some degree of correctness as well. But if you call them savages, then it is okay to harm them because they are savages. Much like if you were to you have vermin, we got to get rid of the vermin because they're on our property and things like that. Okay, yeah, vermin sounds like a negative thing. You don't want to have vermin. But if you said you want to get rid of all the field mice. Well, okay. Now we're kind of talking about an animal all of a sudden instead of a classification of animal. So people feel differently about that. And the agriculture needs aside, there's very clearly a difference between referring to something as a vermin and something as a field mouse. Right? We feel differently about it, right? If someone says, "Yeah, I killed that vermin," or "I killed that field mouse," all of a sudden you feel sorry for the field mouse because they got killed, but not the vermin because it means something different. So we can use emotive language as a way to trigger people into thinking something. So like if we're talking about freshmen, for example, it's like, ugh, those disgusting freshmen. People are like, yeah, those disgusting freshmen, right? Oh. And and all of a sudden people feel better about mistreating freshmen because they're just disgusting freshmen. They're barely even people. I mean, they're seniors essentially, right? They're barely even out of high school. So we can talk about them as long as we put a little bit of stink on it. I mean, I wouldn't. They would. I wouldn't do that because I'm turning over a new leaf. Freshmen are kind and reasonable people, I suppose. Next is attacking the person. This is called an ad hominem. An ad hominem means to the body or to the human. And what that means is that we attack the man or person. I think classically we've talked about, especially in science and based on the Latin origins, the word hominem means human. And then it had kind of developed into meaning man and then mankind. So I know that there's a kind of trickiness about how we talk about mankind and everything. I get that, but that's kind of where that word comes from. So if we're going to talk about the etiology of the word, we have to talk about the fact that it means mankind, humanity, as opposed to man, people with testicles and a penis, for example. So when we have an ad hominem, we attack the person rather than their argument. And we do this a lot. We say something like, well, what does he know? He's just a ... Right? So all we talk about is the person and their shortfalls and not what their arguments are. So the example here is that Senator Jones is a crook who has taken illegal bribes. Why should you listen to his proposal? So what that means is that you could have a perfectly good proposal, for example, and the person is taking a bribe. And for some reason, those two are connected. Now, it's possible that the illegal bribe has something to do with the proposal. But if the proposal is good and sound and reasonable and is beneficial, the proposal itself is still good. The person, putting forth the proposal has some character flaws and some issues, but that doesn't take away from the validity of the proposal. But we will make an argument that because the person has issues, they cannot make a good argument. They cannot come up with a good proposal. And that's a problem, right? Now, we can understand that somebody has a good idea even if they're a schmuck. Okay? So we have to be careful that we don't just attack the person and invalidate what they think just because they have some kind of character or personal flaw. There are varying levels of ad hominems or attacking the person. So we have name calling. You're an idiot, right? So no matter what you say, it's not going to be good because you're an idiot. The ad hominem itself attacks the characteristics of the person, responding to tone. So what happens is that somebody says, I'm not going to talk to you if you're just going to be, angry. Well, okay, fine. You don't have to talk to somebody because they're being angry, but that doesn't invalidate their argument just because they're angry. Okay. You can also contradict somebody just being on the opposite side because you want to. You can come up with a counter argument, okay, but not have a reason behind it. So you can formulate something that's reasonable to counter argue, but not have support for it. You can refute something. Okay, so what that means is that you can say, well, what you're saying is just wrong, and here's why. Maybe you use lack of evidence. You don't provide anything else to support your side of it. You just kind of deny what they're saying. Okay, and then the highest point of an ad hominem is refuting the central point, which is the better thing to do. If you're saying, yeah, you have issues, but I'm going to talk about your point. Okay, so if you're talking about somebody's point, you're having a decent argument, even if they have character flaws and you don't like their tone, and all you want to do is just contradict them. That's all okay. But if you stick on the central point of what their argument is, you're actually having a conversation. It may not be productive because there may be some other things going on, but you're arguing the central point, which is the idea of having a conversation where you have a disagreement with somebody. Now, a euphemism is another way that we can use language to either intensify our argument or de-intensify our argument. So a euphemism is a way to put something in language that is usually more palatable, more acceptable than what it is. And we have euphemisms all over our language. Okay, so a euphemism, for example, might be something like, instead of saying my dog died, right, we would say something like my dog crossed the rainbow bridge, right? That's a way to have somebody listen to what we say and to be able to talk about death in a way that people will hear you and that you yourself can talk about it, because the words my dog died sound a lot different than my dog crossed the rainbow bridge. If you go to the PowerPoint, you can click this link here. I can't play it on this video because if I do, it'll get a copyright claim and I won't be able to have my video up. But this is George Carlin, the late comedian George Carlin, who was a political satirist and an observational comedian. And he'll talk about some euphemisms that we have in the language. There is some very offensive language because that's what he liked to do. But you can hear, if you want to Google George Carlin euphemisms, you can do that too, I suppose. But if you go to that video that I provided to you, you can see that there's up to about 3 minutes or so. There's a series of euphemisms that you can look. Some of them, he makes them funny because he's a satirist, he's a comedian, but they're just kind of funny. The example that comes from the text is that we should continue the use of drones to attack the enemy because it has turned the war around and the collateral damage is minimal. Collateral damage. That sounds like people are going to die, which is exactly what it is. Kind of related to that is friendly fire, right? Friendly fire doesn't sound so bad, right? When we think about, the term friendly fire. But what friendly fire is when you accidentally shoot and kill your own troops. That's not a good thing, but we call it friendly fire as opposed to, killing your own people, which doesn't sound very good. All right, so let's jump into another section of this called language that impedes clear thinking and communication. So we always try to use clarity in writing. Of course, there are times when being clever and witty is a good thing, especially in fiction writing or creative nonfiction writing. But whatever it is, we strive to be clear. There are some good grammar books out there and style books that stress clarity and concision, meaning that we want to be clear and in the shortest way possible. But there are times when being clever and witty can be fun, and that's fine too, especially things like poetry, for example. But clarity, again, if we want to be precise, we want to minimize the amount of noise that comes in our communication. I mean, kind of like the extraneous words that we need to use in order to communicate something to the receiver. Okay? So if I'm sending information, I want to do it as clearly as possible. Okay. We try to clear up things like confusion, misunderstanding, wrong inferences, ambiguity in writing. Ambiguity. What did I even say? I can't even re-say what I said wrong. That's weird. We want to clear up ambiguity in our writing so that the information that we're conveying is clear. We want to avoid inadequate comparisons, meaning that if we are going to create an argument and we are going to compare our group of something that we're arguing about to another group that we're arguing about, those need to be very clear groups that we're talking about. And I'll tell you what, in research, this happens a lot, where somebody will say something like, based on a comparison group, our results are twice as good. Okay, what's the comparison group comprised of? Who are those people? What are their characteristics? Are they just like the people that you got your results from? Are they different? What does that group look like? Okay, advertisers use this a lot. Compared to the competition, our toothpaste whitens better. Okay, what's the competition? We might think to ourselves, oh, it's a Crest Colgate thing. Okay, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a Crest and dollar store brand or whatever. We need to know what that comparison group is. So, for example, the advertiser says that its product is the best without specifying the reference group or identifying what makes it the best. Okay, so what makes your toothpaste the best, right? Is it because it has a cool tube, the colors come out a certain way, it tastes best? What's best about it? And we just gobble this up as consumers. We don't really care. We're like, oh, they said it's the best, so it must be the best. We buy into it, but we have to realize that we're lacking comparison. So if you're going to make a comparison between two things or more, you need to identify which two things or more you're making comparison about. Otherwise, what you're comparing probably is going to fall flat. We also want to avoid what are called weasel words. These are words that take your argument and kind of dilute them a little bit. Okay, what they're called are hedgers or qualifiers. So they take what you're trying to say and then they qualify it so that it loses some meaning. Okay, so if I said to you, the side effects of the drug are harmless, you'd be like, oh, okay, that's fine. But if I said the side effects of the drugs are relatively harmless, okay, wait a second, relatively compared to what? Relatively compared to headaches? Okay, fine. That's fine. I don't mind if something's relatively harmless compared to a headache. But if you said relatively harmless compared to, like your hair falling out, your teeth turning green, explosive diarrhea, things like that. It's like, wait a second. I don't want that. That's not relatively enough harmless compared to what you're talking about. So we use these hedge words or weasel words in order to qualify something. We can be more precise about our qualification if that's the case. So if you want to say the side effects of the drugs are relatively harmless compared to something else, you can do that. But don't just say they're relatively harmless or else you're weaseling out of describing something. All right. Then let's see. The next one is vagueness. So vagueness is when we use imprecise words, words that can have many meanings, words that are ambiguous, lots of different ways that we can be vague. And one of the examples that they give here is actually a really good example. There's actually, I didn't have any reason to use the word actually. I hedged something that didn't even need to be hedged, so that was stupid. Okay, so this is a really good example. The word rich specifies wealth at the high end, but is rather imprecise at lower values. Okay, so we talk about Oprah we talk about Oprah Winfrey, who's rich, right? Billions of dollars. Okay, but so is somebody who makes $250,000 a year. Right? Those people are both rich. So if I say, boy, that person's rich, you might think, oh, they're millionaires, which people can identify as rich, or that they make $500,000 a year. But if somebody makes $150,000 or $250,000 a year, those people are rich too, but it's less precise. We don't really know what rich means because it's such a wide range of things. It's really above a certain range. Okay? Which is interesting because poor really doesn't work that way because rich has no upper limit. You can be as rich as you want to be. You can't be poorer than having $0. Yeah, you can be in debt, but we're talking about the ability to have, this money available to be what's called solvent. And when you are poor, that's, you don't have to worry about somebody misunderstanding what poor is. Yeah, you might have a debate on where poor starts, right? Does poor start at, a family income of $30,000 a year? Okay, we can do that, but we understand that there's a much smaller range of poor than there is a range of rich. So to use an imprecise word like rich is problematic. Now, if you wanted to operationalize what rich means by saying something like Oprah Winfrey is ultra wealthy, having an accumulated worth of more than $1 billion. Okay, you can identify what that means, ultra wealthy or rich. Then you can say, and the physician is rich because, the physician makes $250,000 or more a year. So you can kind of clarify what that term rich means by operationalizing maybe ultra wealthy compared to rich, and then defining what those things might mean. So you can clarify vagueness by operationalizing things, which kind of sounds like pseudo-profound bullshit. You put things together in a way that sound really, really, really amazing, but don't mean a lot. Okay, so pseudo-profound bullshit is a type of mechanism in language where you can use these fancy-sounding words to mean little to nothing. Okay, so for example, Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra came up with attention and intention are the mechanics of manifestation. Okay, what? What does that even mean? So when you look at that, you think, okay, could that mean something? Attention and intention are the mechanics of manifestation. So paying attention and being intentional are the mechanics of manifestation. So those are what? The things that make other things, right? So what does that even mean? But it sounds good. That's a good bumper sticker. It'd be one of those cool motivational posters, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. It may have a very peculiar meaning for this person, for Deepak Chopra, and he might clarify it a little bit, but that statement on its own doesn't mean a whole lot. And people will do that a whole lot. And it's important that we don't fall for it just because it has a ring to it or it sounds like something. So to ask somebody, okay, what does that mean, is a very reasonable thing. Ambiguous language is a little bit tricky because it's more than just using different words. It's about using words that can be problematic grammatically too. So you kind of have to pay attention to not only if a word has multiple meanings, but also if where it goes in the sentence creates ambiguity. Okay? So ambiguous language are ones that can be interpreted more than one way. All right, so you have to clarify their use. Okay, so the example they use is a little bit silly, but it's ambiguous nonetheless. Morgan ate the ice cream with relish, right? So did she eat it, with a lot of enthusiasm, or did she eat it with this chopped up pickle garnish that people have? Probably it's with gusto, as the example might infer or imply, but she could have eaten it with relish. Would have been a little bit weird, but she could have done it that way. And then grammatically, you could have something like this. Running quickly, the tree almost struck the jogger. Okay. You're probably not thinking that this is problematic, but when you think about what I just said, let's talk about the grammar of it. Okay. Running quickly, comma, the tree almost struck the jogger. So imagine a tree limb falls or something, or a tree falls and almost hits the jogger. Running quickly should be modifying the jogger. Okay. But in the sentence, running quickly, comma, the tree almost struck the jogger, running quickly is modifying the tree. Now, probably nobody in their right mind misinterpret that, but nonetheless, it's ambiguous. It's grammatically ambiguous, so you have to watch out for that. You could rephrase that sentence to say something like, the jogger, as she was running quickly, almost was struck by a tree. Or, the tree nearly struck the jogger who was running quickly. There are several ways to fix that, but if you just say, running quickly, the tree nearly struck the jogger, that is grammatically ambiguous, even though probably contextually you would be able to figure out what it meant. Ambiguous nonetheless, so we have to clarify those things. That's grammatically called a misplaced modifier. Sometimes it's called a dangling modifier. Misplaced is just fine, because misplaced modifiers include dangling modifiers. Whatever, that's a boring grammatical thing. Okay. Then we move on to equivocation, meaning that we take the meaning of an argument away from the central point and focus on some kind of other point, usually something that's ancillary or maybe an error of speech or something like that. So the example that we have here is that only man is only man is rational. No woman is a man. Therefore, no woman is rational. Now, in this example, they're kind of taking this idea of what a man is from a gender or sex perspective. They're focusing in on that and not talking about mankind, right? But what's happening here is that we're focusing on some kind of ancillary part of the argument in order to justify some kind of tenuous perspective at best on this point. Okay? So when you think about equivocation, be thinking about how easy it is for us to focus on something that's not part of the argument as a way to get away from the argument itself, especially when people make a mistake. They'll misspeak or something like that. It's like, oh, you said that wrong, so you must not believe it. Okay, that's not the case. Sometimes people just misspeak, especially during a conversation. How often do you misspeak and you don't catch it and somebody else does, and you would not appreciate if they just kind of like attach themselves to that point. Okay. So as we've gone through a couple of these, let's kind of stop and think about what this impediment to clarity might be. Okay, so Dr. Gillespie said, Xylotom is an effective treatment for anxiety. I think more people should use it. Okay, so what's the impediment and how do we fix the problem? I'll give you just a second to go back and review the ones that we talked about. And if you haven't paused by now, we're going to go ahead. So hurry up and pause if you want to go back and check. 3, 2, 1. And here we go. The word effective is vague because it does not specify how the drug is effective. Okay. Dr. Gillespie is also not making an adequate comparison. We might ask effective compared to what? Okay. You could fix this by saying something like Xylotom reduces symptoms of anxiety significantly better than both the placebo and the next best anti-anxiety drug on the market. Okay. That would be a reasonable thing to say, as opposed to just plainly Xylotom is an effective treatment for anxiety. Okay. A lot of drugs are effective treatment for anxiety, especially sedatives, but that doesn't mean that they are good drugs to use. So, drugs can be good for anxiety because maybe they make you fall asleep or something like that, which is not really, clinically helpful, although it does reduce symptoms of anxiety because most people don't suffer from anxiety while they're sleeping, which is why most people sleep when they have anxiety. Okay. So here's a quick table. This is also from your book, so you can feel free to refer back to that. If you want to take a screenshot of this and add it to however you keep your notes, that's okay too. So let's move on to why writing is important. So writing is important for a lot of reasons, but we first have to understand that writing is a demanding task. And no, that is a demanding task does not justify why it's important, but we recognize its importance and we go through the demanding task that writing is. So we're kind of almost talking about this antecedent as if it's somehow justifying, the demanding task. That's not the case, but we have to understand that we're kind of starting at the end and then creating a case for ourselves. So writing is a demanding task. It does place great demands on attention and working memory. You have to be thinking about what you're writing. And you also have to be thinking about the content of what you're writing, and that's where the working memory comes in. Okay, we see a lot of times that effective writing skills are not being taught as broadly as they should. Okay, and what happens is mostly writing is taught as this big thing that you just do all at once. But the good news is that we can break it down into smaller steps. Okay. So here comes the writing process. And this table kind of gives us it's a reasonable breakdown of the steps that we take in writing, although there's more to each strategy and action in each of those columns, or in that column that you see at the end. But we want to collect information, we want to plan, we want to translate ideas into text, and we want to review. So before we even put something into text, we have to collect information and plan. So before we write much down, we want to figure out what we're going to write. Again, you can take a screenshot of this, or you can refer to the text for this. Please understand that writing is not linear. You don't just finish something, move on, because lots of times you learn something new, or you figure out, oh, I should have written more about this 3 paragraphs earlier in order to support what I'm saying now. And when we get to that point where we're revising, we'll go sentence by sentence and be like, oh, this doesn't connect as well as I thought it did. And then you'll make a better connection. You'll move things around. You'll switch things. And that's okay. And even within writing a single sentence, we're going to be changing the way the sentence is formulated. Maybe we'll choose to reorganize the sentence so that it flows into the next sentence better, especially with these transitional sentences that we have between paragraphs. So don't be discouraged if you have to go back and rewrite things or move things around, because we aren't good enough on the first go to just write something from front to back and have it be exactly right. And that's okay. That's okay. Our minds are networks. We shouldn't expect that our writing is anything else but a network. We shouldn't expect that our writing comes out completely linear. Okay. So when you think about writing, you have to ask yourself, what should you write? Well, spoiler alert, most of the time you're going to be writing based on a prompt that you're given. Unless you're writing something that's a project, or that's maybe a research article or something where you get to pick what your topic is, you're generally being told what to write about. So that's kind of like the number one thing. You write about what you're told to write about. But when you have an option to write about something that you're not told to write about, then pick a topic that interests you and that you can get information about. Okay. You want to write about something in a way that the prompt asks you to. So if you're writing some kind of analytical essay, you'll want to write something about something that can be analyzed. If you want to write a review of something, then you want to find a lot of different types of information about the thing you're reviewing and collect it and put it all together. So what you want to write about is largely based on the style of writing that you're doing, the type of writing, which we'll look at in a second. And then you want to look at the clues within the writing prompt that tell you how to answer the questions, which can be a little bit tricky, but as we go through the psychology major, you'll get more and more competent at doing that. This is a basic breakdown of the types of essays that you might want to, type of essay prompts that you might be asked to address. And this is something that's taken from another hierarchy in education called Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy moves from the most basic type of information, which is knowledge, just knowing something. And then it's to comprehension. Do you understand something? Then application. Can you apply it to something, some kind of real world issue? Then analysis, then synthesis, where you're bringing things together, and then evaluation, where you're making a decision or a judgment based on the information that you have. So it moves from less intense in terms of information of what you know to most intense of what you know. Because evaluation is you have to make a decision based on what you know. You don't have to make a decision based on what you know in earlier steps, for example. Okay. So when you see some of these words that come up in your writing prompts here, you'll be able to identify that, I need to talk about an application. So I need to be talking about how to apply critical thinking to a current event, right? So how can I use clarity and ambiguity? There it is again. There's that word. What did I say? Ambiguity. I can't even say ambiguity. Oh, it's so weird. Words are weird, man. How you can talk about ambiguity in some kind of current event. So it might be an application. Or if it says, describes something, then you'll just describe it. Right? So there are different ways that you will be asked to address something in a writing prompt in the psychology major, and keeping this list handy can help you to figure out what kind of essay you're going to write and how you're going to attack it. Okay. So here's an example of a writing prompt, and you're going to see some of these buzzwords come out. So see which ways that you could address this. I'll give you a hint. When you see a couple of different words in there and they are at different levels of the essay prompt and on the previous slide, then go with the most intense one, the one that has the most, I almost sneezed, the most rigor to it. Okay. So here it is. Suppose a person needed help immediately. Decide whether the person would be more likely to receive help if one other person was in the vicinity and was aware of the person's plight versus if a few people were in the vicinity and knew about the person's plight. Explain your decision. So this is a writing prompt. It's about the bystander effect. It's about whether or not people use group mentality to figure out if someone's going to help. Okay, so that's fine. So what words do you see in there that might be on this list? And then what kind of essay response might you apply there? We'll move along in 3, 2, 1. So we default to evaluation because one of the words that we see is decide. So decide is an evaluation task. So decide on something. So you have to take the information that you have found and judge and assess whether it's true or false or other criterion that you have. So you have to talk about what would happen, right? So we need to evaluate. Now, there is also explain in there. The last part of this says to explain your decision, and that is based on comprehension. You have to be able to understand it. But because we also have a decide in here, we're going to combine evaluate this. So evaluate this and then explain what you found. So we're going to use evaluation and comprehension at once. Now, when we talk about organizing your writing, some people really enjoy, see, there's another unnecessary modifier, really enjoy. Some people enjoy to use outlines. Some people just like to go off on their own and start writing how they think, which gets them into trouble a lot because we ought not to write how we think in most cases. Okay? So here's how an outline can help you. This is just a simple structure, and this would be a good outline for a reasonably short essay, maybe a 5-paragraph essay where you have an intro, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. You might expand the conclusion out. You might expand the intro out, whatever you wanted to do. But in either way, you have some kind of writing prompt where there are 3 different things you're going to address. So the introduction might talk about the purpose of writing the paper, how you're going to organize the rest of the paper. So you tell the reader how you're going to address things, and then you define relevant terms if you have them. A thesis statement usually goes the last part of the last part of the intro paragraph. Okay. Then you have maybe a couple paragraphs, 3 paragraphs for the major points that you're going to identify, and maybe there are some sub points that you're going to identify within each of these paragraphs, and then you have a conclusion. Okay. So this can be a way that you choose to address a writing prompt in this or any other course if you'd like to. Sometimes the instructor might say, just get right to the prompts. Don't worry about an intro or conclusion. Some people might not give you any guidance on that. And if they don't give you any guidance, hey, let's go ahead and do an intro and a conclusion paragraph. Not a big deal. And then you put in your writing prompt below it or in between them. So you address the issues that you are going to talk about based on your introductory paragraph. So when you're done outlining, you have to figure out how to put those ideas into text. Okay, so how do I get these ideas from my brain, from my outline, into paragraph form? And remember, it is paragraph form. You're in college now. It's not just sentences every now and again. Okay. One of the biggest things you have to think about, I've seen it written as GUM. I think I like to call it GUM, but it's GUM, grammar, usage, and mechanics. So it's the way that you use grammar in order to create some consistency in your sentences, usage, how you use different words and different sentence structures, and then mechanics, the way that you use indentation. So it's kind of like physical pagination issues, right? Like indentation and spacing and stuff. But also the way that you properly use lists, or maybe you use a series of words and you use commas a certain way. Those are all mechanics that you need to be aware of. All right, so we need to be aware of that because we keep our audience in mind. And the audience needs to be able to read this. Your writing, believe it or not, is not for you. So just because you understand something is not good enough. It has to be understood by the reader. And if it's not clear to the reader, then it's no good. The reader has to be able to understand it. So if your writing is clunky, hard to follow, or you have to go back and try to figure out what you meant in your writing, the reader's going to have a hard time, and it slows them down. And what that does is it takes away from what you're trying to convey. So one of the issues that I will mark people down on in writing is whether or not the reader can follow what they're saying. If it takes me 2 or 3 times to read a single sentence, that's too long. So it needs to be readable. It needs to be understood by the reader. We want to have clarity. We talked about clarity a little bit, but we want to use the simplest, most relevant words in a conventional way, right? We're not writing, these soliloquies. We're not writing monologues that are meant to be these wonderful, beautiful, flowing things. We're trying to convey information in the field of psychology, and that means that we use clarity and concision. What's nice about that is that we don't need to feel so stressed out about using these ornate sentences to fill up space, because most of the time in writing in psychology, there isn't this, there isn't a page number quota. You just write, and when you're done, you're done. Now, in academic writing, we might urge you to write a certain amount because we know that writing, 1 or 2 pages on a 5-point writing prompt won't be good enough. So we give you that kind of oomph to get there. But in general, your papers will need to be as long as necessary to convey the information. They need to be clear. They need to be coherent. Another way to think of coherence is flow. So your ideas need to flow together, that there are logical connections. You don't just jump from topic to topic. One paragraph's end should lead into the next paragraph's beginning. One of the only exceptions to that is if you have a longer paper and you have multiple sections, then you can end a section and start a new section. But generally, within each section of your writing, you want to have some kind of coherence between the paragraphs. Okay. One of the issues that we have to worry about is plagiarism. Okay, so plagiarism, defined by Baines and Baines, here is inclusive but also not exhaustive compared to what we have in the Olivet College academic integrity policy. So always refer to that policy when you are thinking about how to write and what constitutes plagiarism. But these are some 4 basic ideas about plagiarism, is that you can fail to cite someone else's idea you're using. So if you use somebody else's idea, even if you agree with it or you thought of it too, you need to cite that idea. Gone are the days where you can just write something and it's true. You have to cite an idea. Okay. Use someone else's words without citing them. So if you have a quotation, you even put them in quotes, but you don't put a citation, that's plagiarism because you didn't give credit to the author. So some people think that plagiarism is about, what I meant to do. It's not. It's about whether or not you gave credit to the authors. So if you take the words and even if I know that those aren't your words, I don't think that you made them up. I don't think that you're trying to pass them off, but you still have to give credit to the author. If you use somebody else's words without quotation marks, even if you cited them, it's plagiarism. Okay. Now, the last one is usually just flat out awful, where you pretend to be the author of some work actually done by somebody else. What's funny about that is that usually people don't, this isn't a problem when people try to plagiarize from the original source. It's when they try to plagiarize from somebody else, like I borrow another student's work. That's the biggest form of pretending that you're another author, is by taking another student's work, not by taking the author's work. Okay. So when you cite evidence, and there are mechanics for this based on the American Psychological Association, which is what we abide by. When you cite evidence, you give appropriate credit to the authors. Usually in the reference page, you use in-text citations to support that. So not only do you have a full list of people that you use or references that you used in your references section, you also refer instance by instance to those authors in the paper itself. Okay, citing evidence gives credibility to the evidence. Okay, so if I have some information and I don't cite it, people will think, oh, that shows that he thinks it's not credible because he hasn't done the research, blah, blah, blah. But if I cite evidence by somebody who has done research, then that becomes credible at that point. Okay. It also helps provide information to the readers in a way that they can access the original information if they want to evaluate it, review it, or just have it for themselves. I've done that a lot. I look through a paper, I'm like, wow, I really want to know more about that because I'm doing research that's just like that. So I will go back to the original paper that came from, and I'll be able to maybe pluck an operationalized definition or some other bit of information that's important to me. Within our writing, we need to make counter arguments. So if we are trying to prove a point, it can be strengthened by our counter arguments. People are worried sometimes that if they have a counter argument, that it can weaken their own argument. But really what that does is that it lets the reader know that you considered all sides of this, and based on your evaluation, the argument that you are a proponent of is the one that is the best argument. So including the counter arguments actually improves the argument. It doesn't take away from it. Okay. And then the last part is reviewing and revising. Okay. We ought to be spending a ton of time revising our work. Less than 10% of your time revising your work is the estimate. The most is an estimate. I think there are probably more recent estimates. Unfortunately, I think they're probably going down. That let me start over the sentence. Now I've gotten lost. 10% of students. No, that's not what I mean. Students are spending about 10% of their time reviewing and revising, which is far too little time. I understand that there's an academic pace to keep up, that assignments come due, but in order to do good work, you have to spend a little bit of time revising. I know sometimes it gets boring rereading your work. I get that. I've been there, but it's well worth it. It's well worth it. What it also does is it gives you another source of feedback. So if you can if you can revise and review and reflect on your own work, that can make you a stronger writer by being more intentional about the way that you identify and fix errors and improve your work overall. So it's a tedious process, but it's well worth it. All right, so that's all for chapter 14. There are other things we could talk about, and there are other things that you will address in the discussion board if that's an assignment for you. So make sure that you are paying attention to the assignments on your learning management system, whether it's Blackboard or Canvas. And I look forward to seeing what you're able to turn out based on this, and it will undoubtedly help you with your writing as long as you take what we talked about today seriously. We'll see you next time.